Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series where we build commander decks without breaking the bank. As usual, this is your host Grazit, and today we'll be brewing a budget build featuring the experimental bioweapon turned party member from Final Fantasy VII, Vincent Valentine. But before we continue, please do consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you enjoy this content, and if you really like it, also consider supporting the channel directly either through my Buy Me a Coffee to help keep me caffeinated, or through my Game Nerds affiliate link to net me those sweet kickbacks for any purchases made through them to help fuel my caffeine addiction that way, both in the description below. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see which commander won last week's poll, as well as what we'll be covering on the channel next. Now, with all that chilling out of the way, let's kick off this deck tech by taking a deeper look at its commander and how we're going to be building around them. Vincent Valentine is a dual-faced card, whose front face is a 2/2 assassin that costs 2 and double black that has the following 2 abilities. Firstly, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, we put a number of +1/+1 counters onto Vincent equal to that creature's power. And secondly, whenever Vincent attacks, we may transform him into his back face, Galleon Beast, a 3/2 werewolf beast with trample and lifelink that, when it dies, returns back to the battlefield tapped on its front face. Taking a closer look at the strengths our commander brings to the table, his most apparent out of the gate is his ability to quickly grow himself into a sizable threat as our opponent's creatures on board are sent to the bin, which procs regardless of whether it's us, other opponents, or even the owner of the creature themselves actually sending the creature there, and scales with the size of that creature to give Vincent an even bigger stat boost the bigger the threat is. This then synergizes perfectly with his back face, which we can easily get to by simply attacking in with Vincent, lets us keep the counters from his front face when he transforms, and whose new keywords let us get even more mileage out of his huge stat block by letting us repeatedly punch through blockers and pad our life totals with every swing. And this even comes with its own pseudo-destruction protection in the form of on-death self-reanimation, which does force us to lose the counters on Vincent when it procs, but also forces our opponents to have to waste 2 pieces of removal on him to get him off the board, or, alternatively, gives us a quote-unquote expendable body we can use to sack for value and that we can then regrow even bigger if there are more powerful targets on board for us to remove. That said, Vincent's kit isn't without its shortcomings, such as his back face's protection being far from perfect, still being very much vulnerable to non-destruction removal and/or opponents that are just willing to 2-for-1 themselves if it means getting a massive beatstick off the table, as well as his low base stats and lack of removal himself making him entirely dependent on our 99 to grow into a sizable threat in the first place. So, considering that our commander wants creatures to be dying left and right in order to make himself into the biggest threat possible, it shouldn't come as any surprise that I decided to take this build primarily in an Edicts-focused direction, filling it to the brim with AoE sack effects to maximize the number of casualties each turn to both grow Vincent and keep our opponent's boards clear of threats, alongside plenty of Death Matters payoffs to generate us additional value and/or inflict even more pain into our opponents with each creature they lose. That said, in order to generate even more value for ourselves, we'll also be including a variety of ways for us to use our life as a resource to make use of the consistent life gain our commander and a decent number of our death triggers provide us with, as well as a small creature recursion package to allow us to get extra usage out of our edicts on bodies and/or allow us to rebuild our board in response to our opponent's removal and wipes, leaving us with a final build that only grows stronger and more resilient as the game progresses, while it picks apart our opponent's board and punishes them for it with each passing turn. Now let us dive back into the world of Final Fantasy VII and explore the tragic past of Vincent Valentine. Initially a Turk working for Shinra, tasked with supervising the Genova project, it would be there that he would meet the love of his life, Lucretia Crescent. Their love, however, was not meant to be, as she had been selected to become the surrogate mother of a Genova-mutated fetus by Professor Hojo, a process that left her in constant and excruciating pain. And when Vincent attempted to interfere to protect her, Hojo had no qualms with shooting him in cold blood, rendering him a comatose and barely alive test subject for him to conduct his horrific experiments on. Eventually, however, Lucrencia learned about Vincent's fate and, in a desperate attempt to revive him, used Chaos-tainted Mako on his shattered body, only for his body to mutate horribly in response, rampaging throughout the facility as he shifted from form to monstrous form until Lucrencia was able to shove the proto-materia into his gaping chest, finally stabilizing him. Now brought to his senses, he was horrified at his monstrous body and consumed with anguish at failing to protect Lucrencia, causing him to flee the facility, eventually finding himself in the Shinra Mansion basement where he would lock himself in a coffin for over 2 decades, both to atone for his sins and to retain control of the Chaos gene running rampant in his body, until he was found by a certain spiky-haired protagonist and offered the opportunity to bring an end to Hojo once and for all. So, now that we know a bit more about our commander and the game plan for this deck, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the edicts we'll be using to maximize Vincent's growth. Opening this category with an entire suite of AoE edicts on bodies that will be able to recur later for extra uses, we have Fleshbag Marauder and Merciless Executioner, both of which force the standard AoE sack onto our opponent's creatures while they sack themselves to proc Vincent and all our other death payoffs between 3 to 4 times with no additional bells and whistles, Wasteland Raider, which provides more of the same but we can create multiple copies of thanks to Squad to cause even more casualties if we have the mana, Demon's Disciple and Plague Crafter, which get a little fancier by also hitting Planeswalkers with their edicts for a bit of extra coverage, the latter forcing a discard instead if our opponents have no creatures or walkers to sacrifice, Gravelighter, which we can alternatively use as a cantrip if something already died that turn for more draw if needed, Accursed Marauder and Chain Devil, both of which force our opponents to sack non-token creatures to prevent them from tossing expendable bodies to them, and lastly, Gaius von Belsar, whose ability to specify either tokens, non-tokens, or enchantments with his edict make him the most flexible source of it we have access to on a body for even better coverage against a wider array of threats. Then moving on to AoE edicts that we can play at flash speed to provide board disruption outside of our turn while not forcing us to sacrifice our own creatures to them, we have Liliana's Triumph as a cheap vanilla instant speed edict that procs our payoffs while keeping the board clear, Sholdred's Edict as another inexpensive edict, though this one again letting us specify if we want to hit tokens or non-tokens and even walkers for extra flexibility, Soul Shatter as a pricier edict that makes up for its higher cost by forcing each opponent to sack their highest power creature, making it a lot harder for them to sacrifice low value targets to it, and Flare of Malice as our most expensive flash speed edict, though we can cast it for free if we sack a creature to it to catch our opponents off guard with it even if we're tapped out, that instead forces all our opponents to sack their highest CMC creature or planeswalker to it to hopefully hit the most valuable targets on each player's board. Now, switching gears from one-shot sources of AoE sacrifice and onto some that are a bit more repeatable, we'll be adding in Braid's Arisen Nightmare, who passively lets us sacrifice our spare creatures, or even a transformed Vincent if we want to quote-unquote reset him, to either force our opponents to lose more of their board or generate us card advantage, making her a repeatable draw 3 per rotation with life loss attached once our opponents are out of creatures to sacrifice, Rankle Master of Pranks, who again lets us sacrifice our creatures to force our opponents to sack more of theirs as he gets in for damage with his evasive body, but can also attack players' hands to strip them of further resources or provide AoE draw instead if we're desperate for cards for added flexibility, and Witch of the Moors, which synergizes nicely with Vincent's life gain, alongside the other sources of it we'll be running in this build, to force yet another repeatable edict onto our opponents, while giving us repeatable creature recursion to let us generate value from our bin. Then, as we close in on the end of this category, we'll be putting in a pair of transforming edicts to generate us some extra value outside of their removal in the form of Tithing Blade, which initially serves as a standard AoE enemy only edict, but then later lets us craft it into a repeatable source of AoE life drain to help whittle down our opponents faster while padding our own life totals, as well as Jekt Reluctant Guardian, who we should be able to transform rather easily in this build, seeing as our opponents won't have many creatures left to block him, and when he does, provides us with a massive 7/7 body for extra damage, 2 instances of card advantage for ourselves and hand disruption for our opponents to widen the resource gap even further, and caps off by forcing each of our opponents to sacrifice 2 of their creatures to further fuel our game plan, sending himself to the bin when he does so we can easily recur him and then do this all over again. And finally, capping off our edicts with a series of them that act more like partial board wipes by inflicting mass losses to each of our opponent's boards rather than the standard one, we have Gix's Command, which, on top of forcing each opponent to sack their highest power creature, lets us, alternatively or in addition to, destroy all 2 power or less creatures to deal with go-wide decks, recur up to 2 creatures from our bin for added graveyard value, and or get more counters onto Vincent to have him hit harder and gain us more life back for superb flexibility, Vona's Hunger, which we can use as a standard enemy-only edict, but more often, we'll wait to cast until after we have the City's Blessing to force all our opponents to sack half of their creatures at instant speed, literally bisecting their creature base for only 3 mana, Archfiend of Depravity, whose ability to reduce each opponent to just 2 creatures each turn is not only devastating on its own, but also makes all our other edicts even more effective at reducing our opponent's creature base to nothing while piling on the damage with its decent-sized evasive stat block. And lastly, Zodiarch Umbral God, which may force us to sacrifice half of our creature base as well when it comes down alongside our opponents, but makes up for it by being an incredibly resilient body that just keeps growing with every casualty inflicted by our edicts, easily pumping himself by +3/+3 and up per AoE edict to inflict greater and greater amounts of damage each turn, making him an equal or even greater threat than even our commander if our opponents have no answer for him. So, now that we've covered the myriad of ways we'll be inflicting mass losses to our opponent's creatures, let's move on to the ways we'll be generating additional value from those losses. Kicking off our Death Matters payoffs with those that help us augment our core stats, we'll begin by adding 2 on-theme ramp sources to the build in the form of Crowded Crypt, which initially functions as a typical mana rock, but, over time, gives us some late-game capability by accumulating counters for every casualty we take, including our edicts on bodies, that we can crack for an instant speed horde of decayed zombies for extra board presence and death triggers when we alpha strike in with them, along with Black Market, which admittedly is expensive for a ramp piece that does stone nothing on its own, but whose death-dependent mana generation rapidly comes online alongside our edicts, easily generating us black mana in the double digits after only a few of them on each of our turns. Then pivoting from on-theme ramp and onto on-theme draw, we'll be slotting in Morbid Opportunist as a relatively cheap source of card advantage that can proc once a turn, allowing us to draw an extra 1 to 4 cards per rotation as we cast our edicts and or our opponents remove any creatures themselves, Talisman of Nurgle as generally an extra card per rotation for a bit of life as creatures die off on our turn, but if we can get that casualty count up to 7, which we can generally accomplish with as little as 2 edicts, can draw us a staggering 7 cards for 7 life instead, which admittedly is a lot of life loss, but nothing Vincent can't simply heal us back from if we really need to reload our hands. And lastly, Harvester of Souls and High Society Hunter as ways for us to draw off any non-token creature dying that also bring their big stats to bear against our opponents, with the latter even being able to make its evasive body bigger provided we have spare creatures to sack to it. And while not being a proper source of card advantage, we'll also be adding in Shadows of the Past as a source of repeatable card selection upon creature's death, with its generally between 3 to 4 instance of Scry 1 per edict helping us dig for land drops in the early game or playables in the late game for added consistency, and its AoE life drain, while mana intensive, giving us some extra reach in the late game as well. And while we're on the topic of drain effects, we'll be adding a few more ways to siphon life from our opponents as they lose their creature base, in the form of Blood Artist, Falkenrath Noble, and Vein Ripper, all of which provide targetable drain for every casualty sustained on the battlefield with their mere presence on bodies we can easily recur if they're dealt with, and the third also generally costing an opponent another body if they want to use targeted removal against it for even more board disruption, along with Fumulus the Infestation, who may only trigger trigger when our opponents specifically sack creatures, which isn't too much of a limitation considering how many edicts we're running, but provides us with an evasive insect token for every creature they sack that it then turns into a repeatable source of on-attack drain, allowing us to continue siphoning away our opponent's life totals long after their boards are clear of creatures. Then, as some additional on-death life loss sources that may not pad our life totals, but bring some additional utility to the table to make up for it, we'll be adding in Sir Conrad the Grim, who inflicts damage onto all our opponents when any creature dies, and also procs when creatures leave the graveyard or are sent to the graveyard from anywhere, enabling him to end the game even faster as we recur our creatures, or pump mana into him for his AoE mill effect, as well as Massacre Worm, which inflicts life loss to creatures' owners as they die off, and, alongside its massive stat block, brings with it a mini-wipe as it hits the board to help clear away any smaller creatures to make those that remain even more susceptible to our AoE edicts. And on the flip side of that coin, we'll also be running Sangromancer as a repeatable source of life gain for ourselves, with it generally being able to gain us 9 life per edict we use so we can stay in the game for even longer and or have more life to burn to our life-paying effects. Now, approaching the end of this category, we'll be making room for a handful of creatures to grow alongside Vincent as creatures die in the form of Venom Crawler, who gets bigger as any creature dies and whose built-in lifelink will help us pad our life totals even faster alongside our commander, Yahenni Undying Partisan, who may only grow as our opponent's creatures die, but whose on-demand indestructibility at the cost of only sacrificing a creature makes them a very hard-to-remove ever-growing threat, and Vashta Narada, who's indestructible by default, grows itself once a turn thanks to Morbid to benefit from removal across an entire rotation, and its built-in Shadow, at the cost of preventing it from blocking, lets it bypass blockers itself to reliably inflict damage turn after turn, making it yet another difficult to remove self-growing body for our opponents to deal with, as well as Tarian's Soul Cleaver, which instead is a piece of equipment that grows the equipped creature with +1/+1 counters when any creature dies, in addition to granting it Vigilance, allowing us to grow any of our creatures alongside Vincent, or simply have Vincent himself grow faster. And finally, as our last on-death payoff to close out this category, we have the death trigger doubling the Masamune, whose on-attack first strike granting and compelled blocks are solid enough on their own at turning any of our self-growing creatures into repeatable spot removal, but we're really running for its ability to double up on any death triggers that the equipped creature may have, allowing Vincent to grow at double the rate if attached to him, or alternatively allowing us to get double the usage out of a good chunk of the death payoffs we just went over for even more value, drain, burn, or growth. So, now that we've gone over all the ways we'll be benefiting from our opponent's creatures dying alongside our commander, let's close out our on-theme game plan pieces by reviewing how we'll be weaponizing our life gain and recurring our creatures for even more value. Starting off this category with life-paying ways we'll be using to pad our core stats, we'll begin by slotting in the ramp source Crick Son of Yawgmoth, whose ability to turn all the black pips on our spells into Phyrexian mana allows us to cast a lot more spells per turn if we have the life to spare, and, thanks to growing himself as we cast those spells and him having built-in lifelink, he also functions as a respectable source of life gain himself alongside Vincent to build our life totals back up again to cast even more spells. Then pivoting from self-damaging ramp and onto self-damaging card advantage, we'll be slotting in both Knight's Whisper and Sign in Blood as cheap one-shot sources of 2 cards for 2 life, the latter also giving us the option to target another player with it if we need a bit of extra reach to finish them off, Call of the Ring and Phyrexian Arena as repeatable sources that proc on our upkeep for extra draw at the cost of 2 or 1 life respectively, the former also providing pseudo-evasion and combat-oriented looting, edicts, and board-wide life loss thanks to the ring tempting us to justify its higher life cost, and lastly, Greed as a repeatable instant speed way for us to pay mana and life to help us dig for more resources, easily allowing us to refill our hands so long as we have the life to spare. And lastly, as some life loss oriented removal to round out our self-damaging core stat pieces, we'll be adding in Infernal Grasp and Bitter Triumph as cheap creature removal, whose 2 and 3 life cost respectively are a small price to pay for being able to hit any creature without restriction at instant speed, the latter alternatively allowing us to pitch a card if we don't have the life to spare, and also hitting planeswalkers for a bit of extra flexibility, along with Feed the Swarm as a much slower piece of removal that may cost us a lot more life depending on what we're targeting, but since it provides us with one of the few ways for mono black to deal with enchantments, we'll be running it. Then, to close out this category, we'll be adding in a small suite of creature recursion pieces to help us get our own resources back from the bin, such as Phyrexian Reclamation, the last of our life-paying effects that allows us to recur a creature back at 1 mana and 2 life a pop, making it an ideal way to recur our Edicts on bodies over and over again to help keep the board clear while triggering our payoffs, Vane Coven Witch, which instead provides creature recursion at 1 mana whenever we gain life, working very nicely alongside Vincent and our life-draining sources to consistently recur our creatures, and finally, Oversold Cemetery, which passively brings our creatures back from our bin to hand at no mana cost so long as we have 4 or more in it, making it a self-sufficient source of recursion that starts bringing our creatures back after one too many edicts or a board wipe. So, having covered all the game plan specific cards in this build, let's wrap up this deck tech by going over our generic core stat pieces as well as our land base. Starting off with our generic ramp pieces, we'll be running the Mana Rock suite consisting of Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, Mind Stone, and a Thought Vessel, all of which provide the build with cheap untapped mana acceleration to help us get to Vincent and our other high CMC spells quickly, with the latter two providing additional upside by either letting us crack it for draw or removing our hand size limit respectively, as well as Charcoal Diamond and Star Compass, which may come into play tapped, but give us more access to black mana production to help cast our more color-intensive spells more reliably, along with the land ramp piece Wayfarer's Bauble, allowing us to cheaply get one more basic swamp into play to help us speed up our mana base just a bit more. Then closing out our generic core stats with 2 pieces of generic removal, as we won't be running any generic draw or wipes in this build, we have Go for the Throat as another cheap piece of spot removal, whose limitation of not being able to deal with artifact creatures still allows us to deal with enough threats to make it worth running, and Overkill as a unique toughness only reducing entry that provides the build with a source of non-destruction removal to deal with otherwise resilient threats that still allows Vincent to grow since the target's power is unaffected. Now, moving on to our land base, we'll be running Myriad Landscape as our lone mana land, whose land-based ramp from our land slot may be a bit on the slow side, but does help us get to the 4 mana needed to cast our commander and our other higher CMC spells for added consistency in the early game. Then, for utility lands, we'll be adding in Bojuka Bog as a silver bullet against any graveyard-focused deck we may encounter that would otherwise benefit from or outright ignore our edicts, Rogue's Passage as a source of on-demand evasion for Vincent in the unlikely scenario where enough of our opponent's creatures survive our edicts to be able to intercept him, and a Demolition Field as a piece of non-basic land destruction from our land slot to help us deal with our opponent's otherwise troublesome utility lands. And lastly, we'll be running 32 swamps as our basics to fill out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the contents of this deck, let's take a look at this build's final breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 22 sources of AoE edicts, giving us plenty of ways to cause as much creature destruction as possible with the least amount of resources in order to grow Vincent as quickly as possible, 21 cards that care about our opponent's creatures dying and or being sacrificed, providing the build with a solid amount of additional value outside of just our commander as we pick apart our opponent's boards, 10 sources of life gain, 10 pay life effects, and 2 cards that care about us gaining life, giving us the means to further pad our life totals and then to use that life to generate us additional value, and lastly, 5 sources of creature recursion so we can continue to use our edicts on bodies for extra disruption and or easily rebuild our creature base after mass removal and wipes. For general deck stats, our final build has 12 ramp sources, 13 draw sources, 26 removal sources, and 5 board wipes, with our removal being off the charts due to the number of edicts we're running to proc Vincent as often as possible, and our wipes, while numerous on paper, either all being mini wipes or only partial wipes, forcing us to rely on the rest of our edicts to pick off any survivors. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.17, leaving us with a mid-weight curve that's not necessarily fast itself, but can certainly punish any opponents that are faster than them with its plethora of board-wide sack effects. The final price of this deck then totals out to be $65.28, not counting the price of basic lands, taxes, or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace prices on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, if we want to make some lateral changes to the build without going over budget, we can consider replacing Fumulus the Infestation and Call of the Ring with the protection pieces Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots, both of which provide cheap targeting protection for Vincent once he's built up, as well as for the rest of our high-value creatures, while also allowing him to swing in and transform himself immediately to make him a deadlier and even more resilient threat at the cost of less life drain and card advantage. Or, alternatively, we can swap out Braid's Arisen Nightmare in favor of Bantu's Monument if we'd rather have ramp in the form of cost reduction for our creature base, and even more AoE drain as we cast them over the repeatable draw and/or edicts of its predecessor. Or if instead we want to further upgrade this build by increasing the budget, we can improve our ramp package by cutting Star Compass and Chain Devil in favor of Jet Medallion and Crypt Ghast, the former reducing the cost of all our black spells by 1 for only 2 mana, and the latter making all our swamps tap for twice as much, as well as providing the build with additional life drain in the form of Extort, augmenting our core stats a bit by replacing Phyrexian Arena with the more flexible black market connections, which, for the same mana cost, can still provide us repeatable draw as well as ramp and extra bodies provided we can pay the extra life each turn, giving ourselves more powerful repeatable edicts and creature recursion by sidelining Gix's Command and Oversold Cemetery for the Phyrexian Praetor's Shuldred and Shuldred Whispering one, the former providing the build with another AoE edict upon entry and then quickly transforming into the True Scriptures, giving us more AoE removal hand attack, and with its last chapter, reanimating all creatures from all graveyards to use against our opponents, while the latter forces a passive edict on our opponents on each of their turns, while allowing us to reanimate our creatures on each of ours to further widen the resource gap, and, as a more niche but very powerful inclusion to help conserve Vincent's power, we can scrap Tithing Blade to make space for the Ozolith, which can store Vincent's counters on itself when he's removed or when he untransforms so we can put them right back onto him later, functionally making all his growth permanent at the cost of a single mana. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Taking a look at the results of last week's poll, it looks like Terra Magical Adept was able to claim the top spot, so look forward to an Enchantress-themed build featuring her coming soon. Then, regarding this week's poll, we'll actually be putting the polls on hold for a time as it appears that the Edge of Eternity's Commander deck lists are already out and I'm going to need some time to cover them. That said, please let me know what you think of these out of the box and what commanders from this upcoming set you want to see me feature in future polls as they're spoiled. And before we go, as usual, please do like, comment, and subscribe to help keep the almighty algorithm appeased. Consider donating to my Buy Me a Coffee or buying product through my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to throw a few bucks my way so I can continue making this content. And if you enjoy content like this, be sure to check out all my other deck techs either floating around my head or on the playlist above. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.